Alright, so genetics, section 2, Mendel's theory. So we're specifically going to look into Mendel and what his theory was, and then some of the outcomes to his experiments. So our bell ringer, that's just the warm-up that you guys had for today. We'll look at the key ideas, and then we'll explain Mendel's results. We'll talk about random segregation of alleles and how alleles are passed on from parent to offspring. We'll then look at Mendel's findings in modern terms, and then we'll also look at Mendel's second experiment. So he went beyond a monohybrid cross, and he actually started testing for dihybrid crosses, where he was looking at more than just contrasting traits. So our bell ringer, gardener, noticed that some of the flowers in her plants were white. In previous years, they'd all been purple. Write down possible explanation for that difference. You should have done that in your warm-up for today. Key ideas. What patterns of heredity were explained by Mendel's hypothesis? What is the law of segregation? How does genotype relate to phenotype? And what is the law of independent assortment? So explaining Mendel's results. Mendel developed several hypotheses to explain what happened in his experiment. Collectively, those hypotheses are called the Mendelian theory of heredity, and they help to form what we know of today as modern genetics. It helps to explain simple patterns of inheritance, so how we get the traits that we get from our parents. And in those patterns, we get two of several versions of a gene, and they combine and result in one of several possible traits. Anytime we talk about the different possibilities that we get from a parent as far as the genetic information, each version of a gene we will call an allele. So an allele is one version of a gene. So for example, blue eyes, brown eyes. If we were talking about the blue eye allele, it would be only one version of the gene that codes for eye color. There are numerous genes that code for, or numerous versions of the gene that code for eye color. So anytime we talk about one of those possible versions, we call that an allele.
In domesticated guinea pigs, there are two forms of the gene for hair color, black and brown. We refer to the alternative forms of a gene as alleles. What's the difference between a gene and an allele? Think of a gene as a street address and an allele as what's found at that address. Now look at the genes for hair color on this pair of like chromosomes. The gene on the left contains the allele for black hair color. The gene on the right contains the allele for brown hair color.
Okay, so right here are the two genes that are for hair color. The one on the left is the allele for black fur. The one on the right is the allele for brown hair. And these are the same gene, just different versions. Okay, so we get contrasting versions from our parents. So each allele that you get or that you have can lead to a unique trait. And our traits come from either parent, or they can be due to blending of both alleles that we get from each parent. Alleles separate during the formation of sex cells. So remember, sex cells are also called gametes. So when cells are created inside of the body, whether mom or dad, and those sex cells are created, there's an independent assortment that occurs. Our bodies, instead of giving all of the genetic information that we have to those sex cells, to those gametes, only half of that information is put into those gametes. So we give one of the two alleles that we have. So only one pair is passed on to the offspring. Okay, only one allele of the two that we have is passed on to offspring. for each gene. So example of that. In Mendel's experiment, he looked at color of seeds. In this case, we're looking at the color of seed being yellow or being green. The dominant allele in this case is yellow. The recessive is green. Okay, so each gamete receives one allele from the parent. So in this case, the parent only had a yellow gamete, or a yellow allele to give, so it gave a yellow allele. In this case, this parent only had the green allele to give, so it can only give a green allele. When fertilization occurs, the combination requires the offspring to have a yellow allele and a green allele. And in this case, the yellow allele is dominant over the green allele, so the expressed trait is yellow. So the offspring received one allele from each parent. Uppercase Y equals yellow seeds. Lowercase y equals green seeds. Alright, so anytime an allele is fully expressed, whenever it is found, whenever it's present, we call that dominant. Anytime that an allele is not expressed when a dominant allele is present, that is recessive. A great example of this is blue eye color. And there are more genes than just one that control eye color, but in this instance we can use it just as a basis or an example for explaining this dominant and recessive. In order for you to have blue eyes, you had to get a recessive allele from both parents. Okay? So mom had to give you a recessive allele, dad had to give you a recessive allele in order for you to have blue eyes. If you have brown eyes, you only have to have one dominant allele. So dad maybe gave you one dominant allele, but mom maybe gave you a recessive allele. In that case, you are still going to be brown-eyed, because the allele that is expressed, or the dominant allele, is being expressed in that instance. Okay, so a recessive allele is expressed only when there is no dominant allele present. You have to have two recessive alleles in order to have a recessive allele to be expressed. And then traits may also be called dominant or recessive. I don't have a very good example of that, to be honest. Sometimes we call, like, blonde hair a recessive trait. So you have a recessive trait if you are blonde hair. Example of that, I guess, is the best example.
When I mated a guinea pig with black fur to one with brown fur, all of the offspring they produced had black fur. Each offspring inherits one allele from each parent. You can see that the allele for brown hair color is not expressed when the allele for black hair color is inherited. Mendel saw the same pattern in his experiments. He called the allele for a trait that is always expressed dominant, and the allele for a trait that is hidden recessive. In this case, the allele for black hair color is a dominant allele. The allele for brown hair color is a recessive allele.
Okay, so the dominant allele was given from the black parent generation. The recessive allele was given from the brown parent generation. But the offspring always ended up being black. The reason that they are black, in their fur color is black, is because that dominant allele is passed on from the black parent. Random segregation of alleles. Chromosomes chromosome pairs split randomly during meiosis. So remember, meiosis is that time in your body, or the stage in your body where the sex cells are created. And in this case, either one pair of homologous chromosomes might end up in any one gamete. So simply put, the alleles that you give to your offspring, or any organism gives to its offspring, you can give either one of the pair that you have. And chance decides which allele will be passed on. We use probability to try to explain that chance, but ultimately it just simply comes down to chance. It's basically a roll of the dice. So in modern terms, the law of segregation holds that when an organism produces gametes, each pair of alleles is separated, and each gamete has an equal chance of receiving either one of the alleles. So it's a 50-50 chance. When you're talking about a gene that has two alleles, it's a 50-50 chance that you will get one or the other. Alright, so when we write out our codes, we use letters to represent the function of alleles. A dominant allele is shown with a capital letter, and typically we put the dominant letter or the capital letter first. A recessive allele is shown as a lowercase letter. And just a note, offspring do not show a trait for every allele that they receive. Instead, there's a combination of alleles that help to determine traits. So the set of specific combination of alleles that an individual has for a character is called the genotype. And genotype, whenever we write out the genotype, that's when we write those letters. A detectable trait that is exhibited is called a phenotype. And the genotype determines the phenotype. So from figure 1, we talked about yellow seed color versus green seed color. The genotype for an offspring that has green seeds, that offspring its genotype would always be little y, little y. Its phenotype is the color that is expressed. So in this case, the color that is expressed is green. So the genotype is the genes that make it up. The phenotype is the physical trait that is expressed.
Letters are used to represent genes. Let's use the letter B to represent the gene for hair color in guinea pigs. This offspring received the dominant allele for black hair color from its parent with black fur. Here we use the uppercase B to represent the dominant allele. The offspring also received a recessive allele for brown hair color from its parent with brown fur. We use the lowercase b to represent a recessive allele. This set of letters indicates the alleles this individual has inherited for hair color. We call this the individual's genotype.
Most organisms, like the pea plant these flowers came from, are diploid. This means that they have two copies of each gene. One gene is part of the chromosome contributed by one parent, and the other gene is part of the chromosome contributed by the other parent. There are alternative versions of genes. For example, the gene for flower color in peas can exist in a purple version or a white version. The different versions of a gene are called its alleles. Genotype is the combination of alleles an organism has for one or more specific traits. We use a capital letter to indicate a dominant allele, such as purple petal color, and a lowercase letter to indicate a recessive allele, such as white petal color. Phenotype refers to what we can see or measure with respect to a trait. If the pea plant has at least one dominant allele, the phenotype for flower color is purple. If the pea plant has only recessive alleles, the phenotype for flower color is white.
Alright, so the phenotype is determined by the genotype. And in this case, anytime the uppercase P shows up, the flower color is purple. The phenotype is purple. So which of these alleles is dominant and which one is recessive? Purple is dominant, white is recessive. Because anytime the uppercase P shows up, the purple allele shows up, the flower is purple. So if an individual has two identical alleles for a certain gene, the individual is homozygous. So if an individual has uppercase Y, it is homozygous. And in that case, we would call it homozygous dominant. If the individual has lowercase y, it is still homozygous because it has the same alleles. However, it would be homozygous recessive because it has two recessive alleles. If an individual has two different alleles for a certain gene, the individual is considered heterozygous. So that the example of that would be uppercase Y, lowercase y.
Dominant alleles are represented by capital letters. For example, the allele for purple flowers is represented by a capital P. Recessive alleles are represented by lowercase letters. For example, the allele for white flowers is represented by a lowercase p. A homozygous individual has two copies of the same allele for a given trait. For example, a purple flower with the genotype capital P is homozygous for purple flowers. A white flower with the genotype lowercase p is homozygous for white flowers. A heterozygous individual has two different alleles for a given trait. For example, a purple flower with the genotype capital P, lowercase p, is heterozygous for flower color. The genotypes result in different appearances or phenotypes for the flowers. In this case, purple flower color is dominant. A flower with even one allele for purple flower color will have purple flowers. Flowers with two recessive alleles will have white flowers. Note that the phenotype can be determined from the genotype, but the genotype cannot always be determined from the phenotype.
So we would know the genotype if we had white flower color because we know that it's recessive and there can't be a dominant allele present. But in this case, if we had purple flower color, it could be one or the other of the genotype big P, or big P, little p. So the phenotype cannot always tell us the genotype, but the genotype can always tell us the phenotype. So Mendel went even further and he performed a second experiment. And in this case, he did a dihybrid cross. In a dihybrid cross, he ended up crossing two characters, such as seed color and seed shape. So he looked at two traits. He used a dihybrid cross in his second experiment, and he found that the inheritance of one character did not affect the inheritance of the other character. So there had to be some independent assortment that occurred. If there was an independent assortment, he would have thought, or he would have concluded that maybe the allele for green could mix with the height gene or the seed shape gene. In this case, he found that they sorted independently. So the law of independent assortment holds that during gamete formation, during sex cell formation, the alleles of each gene separate independently. So when alleles are separated into the gametes, they do not separate together. So in his dihybrid cross, he took yellow and round seeds for the parents, and green and wrinkled seeds. And his offspring, he found that he got yellow and round seeds, yellow and wrinkled seeds, green and round seeds, and green and wrinkled seeds. he didn't just get a case where there was yellow and round or green and wrinkle. He got a mixing of the characteristics. Genes are said to be linked when they are close together on chromosomes. We have certain genes that are very close to one another on chromosomes. So when independent assortment occurs, when alleles are formed, typically those genes kind of go together with one another. And Mendel didn't know this, but later on we found out that genes are linked to each other on parts of chromosomes. So one gene might line up right next to another gene on the same chromosome. And genes that are located close together on the same chromosome will rarely separate independently. When separation occurs, they usually go together because they're so close to one another. The genes that follow Mendel's law of independent assortment are those genes that are either on separate chromosomes or are far apart from one another. So in summary, Mendelian theory explains simple patterns of inheritance. In these patterns, two of several versions of a gene combine and result in one of several possible traits. In modern terms, the law of segregation holds that when an organism produces gametes, each pair of alleles is separated and each gamete has an equal chance of receiving either one of the alleles. Genotype determines phenotype, but also remember, phenotype does not always necessarily determine genotype. The law of independent assortment holds that during gamete formation, the alleles of each gene separate independently.